Welcome back to the second session of the 20th century novel. We stopped last time on chapter 3, talking about influential authors and their works, part 2. As the century progressed previously, marginalized voices gained increasing prominence, enriching literature with perspectives shaped by experiences of racism, colonism, and the cultural hybridity. These writers didn't simply adopt existing forms but transformed them, creating new aesthetics that reflected their distinct cultural positions and concerns. This shift was politically significant. For centuries, literature was dominated by white male European and American voices. Other perspectives appeared primarily through stereotypical representations created by outsiders. The late 20th century saw this begin to change fundamentally through struggles for equal representation continue. Now let's move to Toni Morrison. Beloved, Morrison's 1987 novel confronts slavery's trauma through the story of this a former slave haunted by her past and by the ghost of the infant daughter she killed to save from the slavery. Morrison's lyrical prose, non-linear structure, and unflinching examination of slavery's psychological legacy earned her the Nobel Prize and established her as one of the Americans' greatest novelists. Beloved demonstrates how historical trauma persists across generations and how narrative can begin the work of healing. Morrison based the novel on Margaret Garner's true story, an enslaved woman who killed her child rather than see her returned to slavery after a failed escape. This historically grounded horror anchors the novel's supernatural elements in reality. Gabriella or Gabriel Garcia Marquez 100 Years of Solitude 100 عام من العزلة. Garcia Marquez's 1967 masterpiece chronicles the Buyenda family across 7 generations in the fiction town of Macondo. Through magical realism, treating fantastic events as ordinary occurrences, he captures Latin American history, mythology, and reality. The novels technique, cyclical time, uh, prophetic manuscripts, and blurred boundaries between life and death creates an enchanted yet deeply political narratives about colonialism, revolution, and repetition. Magical realism became the signature style of Latin American literature. Though it has roots in many traditions, it treats magical events, flying carpets, women ascending to heaven while folding sheets, rain lasting years as ordinary occurrences requiring no explanation or surprise. Now let's move to George Orwell, 1984. Published in 1980, in 1949, Orwell's dystopian novel imagines a totalitarian future where the party controls not just behavior, but thought itself through surveillance, propaganda, and the language manipulation. Big Brother, double think, and Thought crime entered the common vocabulary, while the novel's warning about authoritarianism remain chillingly relevant. Orwell demonstrates fiction's power to eliminate political dangers and defend freedom. Orwell wrote from experience with totalitarianism. His service in the Spanish Civil War showed him how supposedly revolutionary movements could become oppressive. His work for the BBC during the World War II showed a propagandist's power, and he witnessed Stalin's brutal dictatorship. Now let's move to Jane Rice, Wide Sargasso Sea. Rice's 1966 novel reimagines Charlotte's Bronte's Jane Eyre from the perspective of the mad woman in the attic, revealing her as Antoinette Gosway, a cruel woman destroyed by colonism and patriarchy. This post-colonial response challenges um canonical texts given voices to the Stalins and exposing how imperialism shaped even beloved classics. Rice exemplifies how later writers critically engaged with literary tradition. In Jane Eyre, Bertha Mason is simply mad, violent, animalistic, a monstrous obstacle to Jane, and Rochester's law. Prunitz never gives her voice or backstory. She exists only as what she represents to others. Now let's move to chapter 7. We are going to talk about the case study, The Great Gatsby, historical context, the Roaring Twenties, and the Jazz Age. So, his girl's novel emerged from the unique moment of the 1920s when post-war America experienced unprecedented prosperity, cultural dynamism, and social change. Prohibition, paradoxically, fueled illegal peak 80s and organized crime, jazz and the new dance shocked traditional moralists. Women bobbed their hair and challenged Victorian gender norms. The stock market soared, created novel reach millionaires, while wildness class divides. This glittering surface masked the deeper anxieties about materialism, moral decay, and whether the American dream retained any meaning beyond wealth accumulation. This girl captures both the glamour and the holiness. Now let's move to wealth and moral corruption. Gatsby fortune comes from bootlegging and other criminal enterprises, suggesting that achieving the American dream requires moral compromise. Tom Bochan's inherited wealth breeds arrogance and cruelty, while those without money, like the Wilsons, suffer and die. Fitzgerald suggests wealth corrupts rather than ennobles. Money doesn't make people better. It makes them worse. The wealthy characters are morally bankrupt despite material prosperity. Only Nick, who's not extremely wealthy, retains some moral center, and even he is complicated through his association with these people. Class barriers. Despite democratic ideals, the class divisions prove insurmountable. Gatsby can never truly becomes one of the established elites. His parties attract guests who mock him, and Daisy ultimately chooses the security of her own class over love. The novel exposes how class triumphs individual merit. Gatsby makes himself wealthy, cultivates sophistication, buys a mansion through lavish parties. He performs upper class identity as perfectly as possible, but he can never truly belong because he wasn't born into that class. Now let's move to illusion versus reality. Gatsby constructs and celebrate illusion of himself, while his parties create temporary fantasies that dissolve by morning. Nick gradually sees through surface to disappointing realities beneath. The novel question whether truth exists beyond the stories as well as ourselves. Physical style and symbolism. But before that, may I add that Gatsby's entire identity is constructed. He invented his name originally James Gats, his background, his persona. He performs wealth and sophistication, but its performance, his parties create magical atmosphere, music, lights, food, beautiful people, but dissolve into messy reality by morning, with drunk guests stumbling home and servants cleaning wreckage. Now let's move to the Fitzgerald style and symbolism. Fitzgerald writers or writes with elegance and precision, creating memorable images that work both realistically and symbolically. The green light at Daisy's dock represents both gas-based specific longing and universal human yearning for the unattainable. The eye of Dr. T.J. Ecklerbring on the billboard suggests a goddess world where old moral certainties no longer apply. Giant eyes watch, but do not judge, do not interview, suggesting absent God and secularized modernity. Now let's move to the Valley of Ashes. The Valley of Ashes between West Egg and New York symbolizes the moral and spiritual wasteland beneath jazz, age, glamour, where the poor suffer the consequences of the rich's excesses. Uh, Fitzgerald's first person narrator, Nick Carraway, provides both involvement and distance, making him an ideal observer of events he cannot fully control of understand. Nick is both inside and outside the story. He's Daisy cousin connected to the East Egg elite, but also Midwestern outsider, uncomfortable with their casual cruelty. He's Gatsby neighbor and friend, but also detached, observe, capable of judging. Gatsby delusion. Now let's go to chapter 8, case study Mrs. Dalloway. Modernist narrative structure and the time shifts. Author's novel unfolds over a single June day in 1923 London as Clarissa Dalloway's or Dulawi prepares for a party that evening. However, the present moment constantly opens onto the past through characters, memories, and associations, creating a multi-layered temporal experience. The narrative consciousness flows between different characters, Calaresia, Septimus, Warren Smith, Peter Wallish, others, showing how the individual's mind experience the same day differently while remaining fundamentally isolated from one another. Big Ben's chemists punctuate the narrative, anchoring the flawed interior time to external measured clock time, and emphasizing time's relentless passage. Um, Every half hour, he times interrupt consciousness marketing objects or marking objective time against subjective experience. This contrast between measured public time and flawed psychological time is central theme. Now let's move to mental health and trauma. Septimus Warren Smith, a chill shocked war veteran, suffers hallucinations and eventually commits suicide. His story parallels and contrasts with Claricia's suggesting connections between her social anxieties and his clinical madness. Wolf, who struggles with mental illness, portrays psychological suffering with empathy and insight, critiquing how society fails to address trauma adequately. They prescribe rest, isolation, and proportion, essentially telling him to suppress his experience and confirm when Septimus realizes he'll be institutionalized. He jumps from a window, choosing a death over forced treatment. Now let's move to social class and gender. An upper class woman, Classia's or Claricia's life is comfortable but constrained by social expectations about proper feminine behavior. She must play hostess and maintain appearances. Her identity largely defined through relationships with men, class consciousness, mates every interaction, determining who attends parties, who has voice and agency, and whose suffering matters. Septimus' class matters to his treatment. He is not wealthy enough to receive compassionate care. Classia's class protects her from many hardships while constraining her in others. Now let's move to moments of being. Wolf's beloved life consists of ordinary moments, punctuated by rare instances of intense clarity and meaning. Moments of being the novel captures both the mundane tasks of buying flowers and sewing dresses and the profound regurgitations that illuminate existence. Classeria's party became meaningful not despite but because of its orderness. We're After that, let's talk about time and morality. Characters obsess over aging and death. Clarice is now in her 50s, reflecting on road not taken, particularly her youthful attraction to Sally Seton. Stipton's death reminds her of morality nearness. Wolf explores how consciousness exists in time, yet tries to transcend it through memory, art, and moments of transcend correction. We're temporal, being aware of our temporality, trying to create meaning despite knowing we will die. Now let's move to Wolf's use of stream consciousness. Wolf pioneered techniques for representing consciousness's continuous flow. Her sentences often lack clear boundaries between observation, memory, and reflection, mirroring how thoughtful actually occur. Free and direct discourse blend third-person narration with characters' thoughts, allowing intimate access while maintaining narrative distance. This technique makes internal life as vivid and significant as external action, revolutionizing what novels could present and valuing subjective experience over traditional plot. Victorian novels privilege external action. What characters do matters more than what they think. Wolf's reverses this. Consciousness itself becomes its subject. External action, buying flowers, preparing a party, provides a framework about the real interest lies in interior experience, memory, reflection, and feeling. Now let's move to chapter 9. Case study Beloved, historical background, slavery, and its aftermath. Morrison's novel draws on the true story of Margaret Garner, a enslaved or an enslaved woman who killed her daughter rather than see her returned to slavery after a failed escape attempted in 1856. Set in 1873 Ohio during Reconstruction, the novel explores how slavery's trauma persists long after emancipation. The protagonist Seth has escaped Sweet Home Prison plantation, but her past won't release her physically, manifested in the ghost of her and daughter, beloved, who returns as a young woman. Morrison examines how slavery dehumanized both enslaved and enslavers, destroyed families, and created wounds that cannot simply heal with legal freedom. Slavery's dehumanization was systematic. Enslaved people were legally property, not persons. They could be taught, sold, bred, punched, killed at owner's discretion. Family bonds were not recognized legally. Children could be sold away from paternal spouses, separated permanently. It is systematic dehumanization created trauma that persisted across generations. Uh, Beloved themes, memory and trauma. The novel's non-linear structure mirrors the trauma's refusal to remain in the past. Memories return up unbidden, overwhelming the present. Sis's act of infanticide, which she calls her crawling already. Baby girl represents trauma so severe it cannot be directly narrated or fully preceded. Morrison shows how historical trauma passes through generations, requiring confrontation and community to begin healing. Trauma affects not just those who directly experienced it, but their children and grandchildren. This is surviving daughter Jennifer is traumatized by her mother's past and by growing up in a haunted house. The community is traumatized by collective memory of slavery. Healing requires both individual confrontation of personal trauma and collective acknowledgement of historical trauma. Now let's go to motherhood and sacrifice. Slavery prevented enslaved women from protecting their children who could be sold away at any moment. This is the desperate act of killing her daughter to save her from slavery represents an impossible choice created by an evil system. The novel asks whether her act was love or murder, refusing easy answers while insisting we understand the condition that forced such choices. The question isn't whether it was right or wrong, but recognizing that slavery created situations where no right choice existed, only unbearable options. Morrison refuses to judge, says simply instead demanding we grapple with the moral complexity of actions taken under extreme oppression. Now let's move to supernatural and the history. Beloved Ghost makes literal the way the past haunts present. The supernatural elements serve not as fantasy but as realistic representation of how trauma operates psychologically and collectively. Merson uses a fiction, American spiritual traditions to insist on dimensions of experience that rationalist white frameworks cannot capture or explain. Black spiritual traditions acknowledging ghosts, ancestors, and supernatural dimensions are as valid as Western rationalism that dismisses them by treating the supernatural as real rather than superstitious. Morrison validates African American culture traditions. Now let's move to the Morrison's narrative style and symbolism. Morrison's prose is simultaneously lyric and brutal, beautiful and horrifying. She refuses repetition, fragmentation, and shifting perspectives to create a dense, challenging text that demands active reading. The novel's circular structure and recursive language mirror memories, operations, symbols like the tin tobacco box where Paul D locks his emotions, the tree of Oscars of scars on his back and the numbers on slaves' bodies all represent how slavery literally and figuratively market bodies and psyches. Morrison refuses to make uh, reading comfortable, insisting readers confront painful history directly. The novel demands emotional and intellectual engagement, making its difficulty part of its meaning. Slavery trauma cannot be represented in conventional, beautiful, or easy consumable forms. Now let's go to chapter 10, the role of women writers and feminism. The 20th century witnessed the women writers claiming unprecedented literary authorities and challenging patriarchal narratives that had dominated literature for centuries. As women gained education, voting rights, and access to publishing, they transformed what stories could be told and what perspectives mattered. Feminist literary criticism emerged as a distinct field, examining how gender shapes both literature's production and interpretation. For centuries, the literature was dominated by men, male authors, male protagonists, male perspectives treated as universal. Women who wrote often faced dismissal, published under male syndromes, or were relegated to minor genres like romance or children's literature. Now let's move to the early century modernist pioneers, writers like Virginia Woolf or Virginia Woolf, Gertrude Stein, and Dunjina. Partners experimented boldly with form and content, exploring women's consciousness and experiences with unprecedented depth and complexity. They challenged the assumption that masculine perspectives represented universal experience. Now let's move to the Victorian literature, typically portrayed women through male eyes, love interests, wives, mothers, tem temptresses, um, even when sympathetically portrayed female characters were defined primarily through relationships with men. Now let's move to later uh, century diverse feminism. Intersectional feminism recognized how gender intersects with race, class, sexuality, and other identities. Writers like Toni Morrison, Maxine Hong Kingston, uh, writers like Gloria and Zoldia shows how women's experiences vary across cultural contexts, challenging white middle class feminism's limitations. Early feminism, dominated by white middle class women, often assumed all women shared similar experiences and concerns. Women of color challenged this, pointing out that race profoundly shapes women's experiences. Now let's go for Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. Virginia Woolf's 1929 extended essay argued that for women to write fiction, they need both financial independence and literary space, a room of one's own. She examines how historical poverty and educational exclusion prevented women from achieving literary greatness, famously imagining Shakespeare's equally talented but thwarted sister. Always insists that women must write from their own experience rather than imitating masculine models, and that women's perspectives fundamentally enrich literature. Her analysis remains foundational to feminist criticism. Now let's move to challenging traditional narratives. Women writers challenged plots, conventions that entered the male experience and reduced women to supporting roles. They wrote about pregnancy, motherhood, domestic life, female friendship, and women's intellectual and creative aspirations, topics previously deemed literally. They questioned romance plot that ended in marriage, exposing how such narratives served patriarchal interests. But let's go back to Virginia's Woolf. I have to add that undertaking how structural barriers and not lack of talent explain historical patterns in who gets to create art and whose art gets recognized as significant. But here, I should add that teaching girls their value lies in attracting husbands. Their fulfillment comes through marriage. Their story ends when they marry. Now let's go to contemporary relevance. These struggles remain relevant as women writers still face discrimination, bias in reviews, and assumptions about women's fiction as less serious than male authorized work. Understanding this history helps students recognize ongoing challenges and appreciate how hard won women's literary achievements are. The gains of the 20th century were significant but incomplete. Struggles for equality continue. Now let's go to chapter 11, Race and Post-Colonial Perspectives. The 20th century saw previously colonized peoples and racial minorities claim literary voice, charging racist representations and asserting their own perspectives and stories. This literature doesn't simply add diverse content to existing forms, it transforms literature itself, creating new aesthetics, languages, and narrative strategy that reflect distinct cultural position and histories of oppression and resistance. For centuries, literature was dominated by white European and American voices. People of color appeared primarily through racist stereotypes, primitives, savages, servants, exotic others. Their actual experiences, perspectives, and voices were absent or distorted. Literature as counter-narrative. Writers like Jonas Achbees wrote back against colonial literature that portrayed Africans as primitive and voiceless. Ashby thinks Fall Apart 1958 tells Nigerian history from Igbo's perspectives, showing complex, sophisticated pre-colonial societies destroyed by European invasion. Such works asserted that colonized peoples are subjects of their own stories, not merely objects in European narratives. Before things fall apart, African literature in English was dominated by European authors like Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, or Joyce Carey, Mr. Jason, portraying Africans as primitives without culture or civilization. These racist representations justified colonialism. If African were savages, European role pro civilization. Now let's go to post-colonial theory and hybridity. Now let's go to scholars like Edward Said Guthrie, Spivak, and Homi Baba analyzed how colonialism operated through cultural representation, not just the military force. They showed how literature participated in imperial projects by naturalizing European superiority and non-European inferiority. Post-colonial reading strategies examine texts for racist assumptions, colonial ideologies, and moments of resistance for ambivalence. They expose how even seemingly neutral representations encode colonial power relations. Now, let's move to hybridity and the cultural complexity. Post-colonial writers often occupy in-between positions shaped by multiple cultural influences. Salman Rushdie, Midnight Children, blends Indian and British literary traditions. Ziadi Smith's White Teeth explores immigrant experiences in multicultural London. These writers demonstrate that cultures aren't pure or separate, but constantly intermixing and transforming. Hybridity challenges essentialist thinking that treats cultures as pure, bounded, unchanged. Colonial discourse often portrayed cultures as fundamentally different and incompatible. European and African cultures supposedly had nothing in common. Now let's move to language and power. A central post-colonial question concerns language. Should colonized writers use imperial languages, English, French, or indigenous languages? Many choose strategic use of colonial languages while infusing them with local idiom, syntax, and worldviews, creating new English that challenge linguistic imperialism. This linguistic hybridity becomes a form of resistance. Using colonial languages has advantages, wider audiences, access to international literary markets, engaging with colonial literary traditions, but it also raises concerns about perpetuating linguistic colonisms, losing indigenous languages, and whether you can truly express indigenous experiences and colonizers' language. So let's go to the key post-colonial authors. Chonna Achebe, Nigerian novelist who insisted that colonized peoples must tell their own stories. His work recover pre-colonial African dignity while examining colonialism, devastating impacts on traditional societies and individual caught between worlds. Salman Rushdie, British Indian author known for magical realism and postmodern experimentation. His novels um, explores identity, migration, and religious fundamentalism, and how personal and national histories intertwine in the post-colonial world. Ziad Smith, British writer of Jamaican and English descent, whose novels explore multiculturalism, race, immigration, and identity in contemporary Britain, combining social realism with psychological depth and humor. We will stop here and we'll continue, inshallah, next time, starting from chapter 12 until the end of the PowerPoint. So until next time, tata for now, see you tomorrow.